Looking for a guaranteed way to create content that resonates with your audience? Start a podcast, interview your ideal clients, and let them choose the topic of the interview. Because if your ideal clients care about the topic, there's a good chance the rest of your audience will care about it too. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show and to another episode of our Category Creation Series. I'm John Ruggi, your host for today's episode. Today, we're joined by Chris Hefley, who's currently the Chief Revenue Officer at Retrium and was previously the founder and CEO of LeanKit, one of the very first companies to build software that incorporated lean management principles like Kanban and Scrum into project delivery software. Chris, I am so excited to hear more about your story today. How are you doing?
Doing really well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you bet. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk about your story of founding and growing LeanKit and how you were able to recognize a need for a new category of project delivery software and take that solution to market. But before we do that, I would love it if you could tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and what you're up to right now.
Sure. So my name's Chris. I live in Franklin, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville with my wife and daughter and 3 dogs and 3 cats. We was a co-founder of LeanKit and worked on that until last year. And then after LeanKit was acquired by PlanView, joined a new startup, Retrium. Found a group of co-founders that I really enjoyed working with. I had been informally advising for a little while and started hinting that I would like a job at some point, and they took me up on it, and I joined the team there at Retrium. So enjoying that. It's another interesting software as a service product for a similar market as LeanKit, and fulfilling a need that I definitely saw was needed in big IT and software development shops. So I work from home, and I do a lot of work here in Nashville with the Nashville Entrepreneur Center and various other volunteer organizations as well.
That's great. So to kick things off, let's start with LeanKit and talk about day zero. I guess this would have been around 2009. What were you seeing in the world of project management software at the time, and what led you to building something like LeanKit?
Sure. So when I started LeanKit, I had 3 other co-founders. So there were 4 of us. And we were, the original day zero was we all got together and said, hey, we'd like to start a company together. Who's got an idea? So we started off with the team before we really had the plan for what to do. But as we got to talking about it, I was running a team of developers at the time that had developers in Nashville, the Bahamas, Italy, and Ukraine. And I had a Kanban board. This was at the beginning of sort of the Kanban movement in software development in IT, and it's sort of a follow-on to Agile, and sort of a next evolution of that back in 2008, 2009. And I was doing that with the team that was distributed all over, and I had a Kanban board up on the wall, and I would, at the end of every call-in meeting every day on Skype, I would take a picture of the wall with my phone and email it out to everybody. Was doing that. And so when we decided to try out, see what kind of product we could build on that, we decided we'd build a product to replace that. And at the time, there were not any purpose-built solutions for that. And the add-on features that some other project management platforms had were pretty inadequate for what people in the Kanban community and Lean community were really wanting to do with their Kanban boards, and there just wasn't a good electronic solution for that. So we started off by testing the idea. We created a fake website that looked like it was a real product and said coming soon. And we started tweeting about it and using conference hashtags for people that were going to Kanban and Lean conferences. And we got some interest. Somebody from the BBC called us the first week and said, "Hey, we'd like to try it." And so we said, "Well, we haven't built it yet. What would you like it to be?" We got some good feedback from some early adopters in the industry as we got started, and some good validation for the idea as we got started building.
So you were taking a process that you were very much doing manually with sticky notes, photos, emailing those out, and trying to replicate that in a software fashion. I'm curious, what if you were in project management at the time or software development at the time, what were the tools that were, I guess, the next best alternatives at the time?
So this is a great part of the story because I hated. I was a software developer and I hated project management tools. We used to joke about friends don't let friends use Microsoft Project, and we would go and create our own little simple project management tools as a way of not using the ones that were out there. We had a lot of experience with Jira from Atlassian, which my experience has been that it's very customizable and it looks very nice at the beginning, but after a certain amount of time, a certain amount of people, and a certain amount of customization, people start to hate that too. But we had used just lots of different ones, and there's so many to choose from, and all as a software developer found that I really hated using project management systems, and I hated updating them, and I hated the management side of them, and I hated sitting through meetings where people would flash the screen up on the board and we'd go down the list and people would ask me what percentage complete different items were. And I was the joker who would always say I'm 67.245% repeating, and just trying to just a sort of cantankerous software developers point of view on project management systems, and decided we'd try to build one that we didn't hate.
Yeah, I can relate to that a little bit. Back in the day, I used Microsoft Project myself, probably not knowing any better, and certainly remember a few headaches and challenges that came out with trying to learn that platform. So I appreciate where you're coming from, despite not even being a software developer myself.
Mm-hmm.
So as you built out this idea of visual-based project delivery software, what did you do to kind of define this as something different, something unique, rather than just simply a better version of project management software?
So what we had going for us there was the fact that there was an industry movement in that direction. So David Anderson and some other people in the lean and agile community had started talking about and writing about and having conferences about the idea of using Kanban as a way of doing project delivery and introducing incremental change into project delivery systems using Kanban principles and lean principles. And so we had this movement and this set of experts and people writing about things, and the existing tools just didn't do what these community leaders and thought leaders were trying to do. And so in the Kanban community, there was pretty much a antipathy towards tools in general, which is not uncommon in Agile at large either. But the people wanted, a lot of flexibility in terms of how to design the boards and didn't want the restrictions of traditional views of project management. So we found that the interest we were getting was from that set of early adopters. And so we focused our efforts on trying to enable the things that the community leaders were already trying to preach and promote. And we got out ahead of that. We got to know all those people, became one of those people eventually. I got onto the speaker circuit, started talking at conferences and writing about it. We did ebooks. One of the other co-founders did as well. He also is still out there doing that on the speaker circuit. And so we had a sort of a force behind us there that sort of helped guide us into creating this new category of tool, and that set us apart from traditional project management tools. And for people that were committed to using this new approach, LeanKit became, and still is really, the most flexible, least restrictive platform for doing Kanban, especially in an enterprise situation where you're trying to do it at scale. And that's one of the things that came out of those early relationships with people like the BBC and EMC, where the advice we were getting was from people that were trying to do this, but also trying to do it in large organizations. And so that's one of the things that separated us from our competitors eventually, is a lot of the people that came along later were really focused on the small team, single team kind of aspect, whereas we were able to try to meet the needs of larger organization who was also trying to use this new methodology, this new approach.
It's really interesting that you're in a situation where, in many ways, the category at large was kind of being developed almost independently of you guys. And what I'm referring to is this idea of using Kanban as a software development approach. And I think what you guys recognized, which was really smart, was that this was a movement that was taking place. There was an increasing amount of interest in using that approach. And what the market needed was some tools to help really enable that and make that process more efficient.
Mm-hmm. And we some of that came out of our own experience with existing agile methods and seeing the limitations, especially in certain kinds of implementations and dealing with, Scrum, for example, which can be a sort of a process-heavy version of agile, which works great in a lot of situations. But myself and the other co-founders at LeanKit had experienced a certain level of frustration with what was available, and we saw in this Kanban movement a better way of doing things, and saw that there was no tooling to support it. And then hopefully we could step in and fill that gap.
I want to touch on something you mentioned a moment ago. You mentioned that software developers often have an aversion to using tools, especially in the agile context. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious to hear how you guys tackled that challenge yourselves, because it sounds like there were kind of two battles you had to face. One was, of course, convincing people to buy and use LeanKit itself. But then it sounds like there was another challenge you faced with just encouraging software developers to use a tool, any tool, in the first place. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So for the agile world, a lot of times is driven by consultants and coaches. So they'll come into an organization and start training people and coaching people and consulting on how to do things in a more agile way. And those folks like to run workshops and put things, have people think freely and outside of the box and put their work up on the wall and have no restrictions. And the existing project management tools basically had existing data structures. They had a work item, and it had a set of statuses, or it had a set of tags and categories and things like that. And the existing tools would try to visualize that on a board. Well, that was inadequate for what these coaches and trainers were trying to get people to accomplish when they started trying to think about things differently. So they would definitely be very resistant to using tools, because they wanted people to have the freedom of a blank canvas up on the wall to design their work however they wanted. Our message to them was basically two sides to it. One was, that's great, we understand that, and as long as that works for you, keep doing that. If you've got all your people in the same room all the time, and you can do this up on the wall, and you just have the one team that you're working with, then absolutely do it on the wall, have at it. We think that's the best way to go. We acknowledged the strength and the usefulness of that approach and didn't try to say that we had something better. But we said, but when you're in a situation where that doesn't work well, where you have a distributed team, where you have multiple teams that are trying to communicate, when you find you need a tool, we have built the tool that's going to be the best place for you to take your wide open, outside of the box approach and develop it in software. So we don't have the traditional data structures that project management systems usually have. We have a visual first approach, visual metaphor first approach to designing your boards and designing your items and designing your workflow, so that when you're ready for a tool, assuming that you will eventually be needing one, will be the tool that will be the best fit for you. And that generally worked, and we didn't lose out on a lot of business that way, because the people that were, committed to no tooling were generally working with a single team. And there were exceptions to that. There were organizations we heard about who had Kanban boards on every wall physically, and they had people whose entire job it was to go around and, enter all those things into a spreadsheet from every different board around the company. And they did, a lot of labor-intensive things in order to keep from using tools. But for the most part, any organization that started doing this and started finding success with it, most of them eventually were saying, okay, now we need a tool to do this. And we tried to get ourselves to be in the best position to be that tool when they made the switch.
So it sounds like you were able to establish some real credibility early on by kind of addressing the fact that, for certain situations, like you said, when everyone's in the room together, something like LeanKit isn't really necessary, and you guys didn't try to force that onto the market. You kind of recognized where they were coming from and were able to almost empathize with them as fellow software developers, it sounds like.
Exactly. And that, basically saying we admit that that's right, but when the restrictions that are naturally bound to come along, and you want to maintain all the goodness that you built up there on the wall, LeanKit's going to be the right choice.
Mhm. So over time, you saw other visual based development tools come out. Obviously, things like Trello come to mind, or tools like Asana. So in some ways, that means you were doing something right because others were recognizing the need for a visual based approach. So that ultimately, that's a good thing. But there's also a challenge with that because you obviously want to gain as much of that market share in the visual based project management space as possible. So I'm curious, how did you guys go about kind of defending your position and growing your own market share as other competitors in this category emerged?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, when we first started LeanKit, there was very little out there that was competitive. But by the time we had gotten ready to release our first, public beta, we already had a competitor that had released. It was called Agile Zen. Eventually sold to Rally Software, which later then sold to CA. And by the time we got to full release, there was a page out on the internet that showed like 30 different Kanban tools that were being developed. Most of them were open source or small projects or a small team that had come up with something. And so most of them were things that we kept an eye on. There's some out of Poland and some out of Ukraine. They were popping up all over. But we had developed good relationships in the Kanban community. We had a bit of a head start on some of the more advanced features that bigger organizations were looking for. Then when things like Trello came out, that was a whole different approach to things because they took a much more generalized approach. They weren't committed to lean or agile or Kanban at all. They just recognized that visualizing things was a really powerful and easy way of doing things. At least in the beginning, they were almost, they were pretty open about the fact that this is not a Kanban tool. And people in the Kanban community basically said, yeah, Trello is great and all, it's pretty, but it's definitely not a Kanban tool. That's where we ended up separating things. So as Kanban became more popular in the Agile world, it naturally became more watered down and more dispersed. And so people took little things from it a little bit at a time and tried to introduce some visualization into what they were doing without really embracing everything that the people in the Kanban community were promoting. And so our differentiation there was basically that we were the tool that people that were committed to lean and Kanban could depend on to be able to represent the things that they wanted to be able to do. Whereas, Trello didn't have things like work and process limits, didn't have things like sub columns and horizontal slices of the board and all the things that LeanKit had invested in. And so definitely Trello sold for a lot more than LeanKit did when it was acquired. So Trello had some things right and definitely has some great things. And we actually use Trello now at my current job at Retrium. So there's a lot of great things about Trello, and not bashing that at all. But that was our differentiation, is that we were going to be the enterprise choice for people that were committed to lean and Kanban, whereas Trello was much more focused on anything you want to use it for. You can use it for planning your wedding. You can use it for developing software. You can use it for building a building. We don't care. It's just, simple visual management. You decide how you want to do it. LeanKit was a bit more opinionated in a way, but also much more customizable than some of the other tools like Trello that came out later.
So whereas something like Trello ended up being much more of an open-ended platform in terms of how it was used or what was recommended to be used, LeanKit stayed more true to its roots as a agile software development tool.
Yes, absolutely. And the things that we invested in product-wise, we continued to stay on the pulse of the community and on the kinds of reports that people were writing and the kinds of terminology and lingo that people started to use. That all evolved and matured over time as well. And we tried to keep up with that and continue to be able to support the new things that the community was coming up with as well.
So, Chris, you mentioned that Trello was sold for more than LeanKit, but I don't want to play down the success of your company, you guys were acquired by Planview not too long ago. So you guys certainly did a lot of things well and had a very successful outcome. But I am curious, if you were to go back and do things over again, knowing what you know now, is there anything that you do differently?
Um, so one of the things I would do differently for sure is invest sooner in good design. LeanKit at the beginning was developed by 3 software developers and a project manager, none of whom had particularly good visual design skills. And so the early versions of it were Battleship Gray. It looked like a Microsoft thing. It was very, we got a reputation early on for being the most full-featured and ugliest Kanban tool on the market. And we got some grace from that because the people that were the early adopters were, they were more interested in the features. But now that, something I know better now is just how much that matters and how much that played into the success of people like Trello and also some of the other competitors like Agile Zen, that their design was better than ours from day one. And ours, we had to evolve and, slowly get better and better over time. But it was never, some people nowadays, a lot of people approach sort of a design first, user experience first kind of approach to new applications. We didn't have that at all. And that's something I would put a lot more emphasis on. In terms of strategy, I think we probably would do a few less, I think in the early days, we got a little bit distracted by things like partner agreements and things that, trying to resell through other software vendors and things like that, I know now were much more difficult to negotiate and actually get to be successful. And nowadays, I pretty much most of the time, after an initial conversation with somebody about those kinds of things, go, yeah, we're just not ready for that. It's something that in the early days of a company, landing a distribution partner can be great sometimes, but my experience so far in software as a service situations is that it's very difficult long-term kind of thing to negotiate. And those are things that we got a little distracted with at LeanKit at different times that better at not getting distracted about now. So.
Good deal. Well, I appreciate you sharing that advice. Now you're over at Retrium, and I'm curious what you're up to there, and specifically anything that you learned from LeanKit that you're trying to apply in your current role.
Yeah. So, at LeanKit, I was the CEO, and I'm a software developer by trade. And my weakest area was in sales and marketing. At the beginning, another thing I would do differently at LeanKit is we didn't have any salespeople, and we didn't like software. Again, we were cantankerous software developers now. We didn't like salespeople, and we were proud of the fact that we didn't have salespeople. And then, at some point, about 3 years in, we kind of looked up and goes, oh no, we need salespeople. So we had to figure out how to do that in a way that was culturally acceptable to us. And we did, and I'm proud of what we did there. I think that's something I would do. That's something we're doing definitely differently now at Retrium. My experience at LeanKit, I brought in a guy as chief revenue officer, had more experience, who'd been through the process a few times. And he was my mentor and right-hand man for the rest of the time that we were there. His name is Tim Mulrun. And I learned so much from him about sales and marketing, about the selling side of things, about the strategy around revenue generation and the health of revenue and the metrics around understanding the revenue model. And when I was looking for my next challenge after LeanKit, I decided I wanted to find a place where I could do that and be that chief revenue officer, be that guy for some other first-time founder who could come in and be able to help out in that way. I got to know the Retrium founders through a Kanban community contact who saw what they had at a conference and said, hey, you should meet the LeanKit folks. And we got introduced. I really enjoyed the founding team there. And I immediately saw the need for an opportunity for what Retrium has. In Agile, there's a ceremony called a retrospective. It's like an after-action review or a post-mortem. That's something that's done every 2 weeks, usually, to look back on the previous 2 weeks about what we did well and what we're going to do differently. And it's prescribed in most of the Agile methods as a ceremony that you should do, but there's not much guidance given on how to do it. And it turns out it's not an easy meeting to run. It turns out it's a meeting that needs a good facilitator. It's the kind of thing where people need to be honest, talk about what they really think, and drawing that out of people is not always easy. And it's one of the things that Agile development teams complain about most is ineffective, unuseful kind of retrospectives that they continue to have, and often we discuss the same things. They end up becoming gripe sessions. A few people end up dominating the conversation. Not everybody participates. All kinds of problems spring up in organizations trying to do agile at scale, especially when they don't have enough coaches to go around so that every team has a coach all the time. People end up floundering around the retrospective. And with big organizations going agile at an amazing clip, now everybody's either there or on their way there as far as going agile, and the difficulty in facilitating good retrospectives. I saw a great opportunity in what the founders at Retrium had developed, and a tool for basically democratizing facilitation techniques, giving the teams access to good industry best practice kind of approaches to facilitating a meeting, keeping everybody engaged in the meeting, especially if they're distributed situation, and providing great history and follow-up and feedback on the results of those meetings. So at Retrium, I'm Chief Revenue Officer and involved in things like product and pricing and packaging and strategy around revenue generation, and also day-to-day sales work and working on deals and landing new customers as well. So
That's great. I'm hearing some echoes almost of your story with LeanKit, where you were looking at the software development space, identifying some problems, and then building some tools to address those problems. I think that's really cool that you're kind of going through a very similar process now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when I realized that they were talking about retrospectives, I had the thought that, I'm basically an expert in Agile and a community leader. I go around, speak at conferences, and write about it and talk about it. I should be good at this stuff. However, I've been responsible for and a part of way more bad retrospectives and way more ineffective retrospectives in my career than I have good ones. And if somebody like me, who was and is, lives and breathes Agile all the time, is always reading, talking, and thinking about it, can't do this well, how much worse is it going to be for just your average software developer who's just trying to get their job done and trying to run this meeting that everybody says they should run? So I immediately felt it was an immediately felt need as soon as I saw it. It wasn't something I'd been thinking about a lot beforehand, but as soon as I saw that, hey, there's a better way, I immediately got excited about it and said, this is absolutely a similar kind of situation where things that, we like Agile, we love a lot of the things that it does for us, but there are rough edges and there are things that are hard and things that don't work well. So when something comes along that is a new evolution of that and can solve that next level of implementation problems in Agile, it was a nice opportunity and good timing.
Good stuff. Well, Chris, I'd like to end today's episode with just one last question for you. If one of our listeners is out there and they're thinking of pursuing something new, especially a different idea, not just a better version of something that's already out there, but something that's truly unique, what advice do you have to help them be more successful in that endeavor?
So a couple of things. One is to test your idea, kind of like what we did with creating a web page that was really just it looked like a Kanban board, but it was really just me dragging colored divs around on a page, and there was nothing really behind it. And we did a little short video and said coming soon, and we put it out there to see if people were interested. And the amount of interest we got back let us know that we were onto something. Also identified people that gave us great feedback on what to build. So as soon as you can start putting something out there for people to try, or testing your idea in some way, definitely do that. The other thing is, once you start figuring out what the vision is of your product, there's a balance to be struck between responding to your customers' requests and building out your own product strategy. And there's something that you as a product development leader have to figure out, is at what point, where to strike that balance. And there were times when customers at LeanKit were clamoring for list views and calendar views, and we chose to not do that for years in favor of doing other more differentiating features that set us apart from other tools. And so now, don't get distracted by trying to fill in all of the gap features between you and your competitors, when you can spend time developing new differentiating features that will further separate you from competitors. And even if your product has weaknesses, the people that you're really trying to reach will forgive you for those weaknesses for at least a while if you have good enough differentiating features that set you apart as the only solution that does this in a category.
Good deal. So number one, test your idea. Number two, try to strike the right balance between producing your own product vision and responding to customer requests. I love it. Chris, if one of our listeners wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
So my personal email is chris@hefley.org. If you're interested in Retrium too, we can also talk at chris@retrium.com.
Good stuff. Well, thanks again, Chris. It was a real pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks, John. I've enjoyed it, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks to all of you for listening. My name is John Ruggi, and if you want to learn more about category creation, subscribe to the B2B Growth Show and look for episodes with the category creation hashtag. Finally, if you have any questions or want to propose a guest for the series, head to john.marketing to find my contact info. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Digital marketing agencies have a tough job. You have to stay on top of the latest marketing strategies for your clients and your agency. What if there was a way you could address both at the same time? Imagine your agency putting out content with greater quality and quantity. Envision bringing your clients a turnkey solution for one of B2B marketing's fastest growing media strategies, podcasting. You know all those clients asking for your help with their account-based marketing efforts? Picture being the first to bring them the idea of content-based networking, showing them the proven strategy for breaking into their most coveted accounts. Here's the concept. Sweetfish Media is looking to work with a limited number of innovative agencies interested in a new partnership model. We produce a podcast for your agency. You introduce the power of podcasting and Sweetfish services to your clients. Everybody wins. Learn more at sweetfishpartners.com.